On the night of their wedding anniversary, my daughter's husband looked me in the eye and said, "You've never built anything worth respecting." The words fell like a stone into the silence of the room, heavier than any door slammed shut. From that moment, a line was drawn, not by blood, but by pride. He had decided who I was in his mind. Not a man, not a father, not a builder of anything that mattered. To him, I was just an old shadow in the corner, a relic of a time that no longer deserved recognition. My daughter's eyes flickered, torn between love and loyalty, but she said nothing. Her silence cut deeper than his insult, because it meant she had grown used to hearing it. He carried himself with the arrogance of youth, as though the ink on his contracts made him wiser than the hands that had carried bricks, signed deeds, and built foundations before he was even born. In his world, the word business belonged to boardrooms, laptops, and late-night calls. In his world, men like me were nothing more than retired onlookers, outdated and irrelevant. He would glance at me across the table with a tight smile that barely masked disdain, as though tolerating my presence was an act of charity. I saw the way he looked at my clothes, at the watch on my wrist, an old piece with scratches that held more history than he could imagine. He measured worth in shine, in what was new, never in what had endured. When he spoke of growth, he never realized he was standing on the very shoulders of men who once planted the seeds, men he now dismissed. In his laughter I heard mockery, in his tone dismissal, and yet I did not argue. I did not defend myself. A man who knows the truth of his own legacy does not rush to announce it. But there is a pain that lingers when the one who holds your daughter's hand is the one who belittles the hand that once held hers first. There is a quiet wound in watching your family absorb the coldness of a man who cannot see beyond his own reflection. I knew then that every word he spoke was not just about me. It was planting itself in my daughter's heart, reshaping how she remembered her father. That was the true betrayal, sharper than his arrogance, to steal from me not my dignity, but her trust. And so I remained silent, not because I agreed, but because silence can be stronger than any retort. Still, in the pit of my chest, there burned a quiet knowing. His words would one day collapse under the weight of truth. A day would come when his world of polished pride and borrowed respect would shatter. And when it did, it would not be my voice that proved him wrong. It would be history itself. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever faced something similar in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. Your support helps us grow this channel. And now, let's continue. Late at night, when the house was quiet and laughter from the evening had faded into whispers, my daughter found herself standing in the hallway, listening to her husband's voice seeping through the half-closed door. He thought she was asleep, thought his words were safe in the shadows, but they were not. Each syllable carved its way into her chest like glass. He's done nothing with his life. He wasted his years. All he has now is stories. It was said with the certainty of a man who believed he was superior, who believed age diminished value, who believed success only wore a suit and carried a briefcase. She pressed her hand to the wall, steadying herself. She wanted to shout, to defend the man who had carried her through childhood, who had sacrificed so much so she could have the education, the comfort, the very roof she stood beneath. But her tongue refused to move. Her silence was not agreement. It was a cage built from fear of conflict, from the fragile balance of a marriage she did not want to shake. Yet that silence wounded her more than the words themselves, because she knew her father's ears would never hear the insult, but her heart always would. She remembered evenings when her father would return home with dust on his clothes, tired but smiling. never complaining, never asking for praise. She remembered birthdays he worked extra hours to afford, lessons he paid for by skipping meals, shoes he bought her while his own were patched and worn. And now she stood listening to a man, her husband, reduce all of that to nothing more than wasted breath. In that moment, her chest filled with both shame and anger. Shame that she did not defend her father, and anger at the blindness of the man she had chosen. Behind that door, the whispers continued, careless and sharp, like someone tearing pages out of a book, one by one. Each page was a memory of her father, a proof of his worth, shredded by arrogance. She turned away, tears pressing at the corners of her eyes, and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. She wanted to believe her husband would see someday, would open his eyes and recognize the quiet greatness in her father's life. But as the night stretched on, her hope thinned. She feared that every repetition of those words would stain her own heart, making her doubt what she had always known to be true. Her father had lived not in vain, but with purpose deeper than any measure her husband could imagine. That night she did not sleep. She lay awake, the echoes of betrayal crawling through her chest, knowing her silence had joined his insult. It was not just her husband who dismissed her father. It was her own failure to speak that added to the weight. And in the quiet darkness, she wondered, would the truth ever break through? Would the day ever come when her father's worth would shine so brightly that no whisper could smother it? The dinner had been meant as a celebration, a gathering where family and friends shared warmth over food and stories. But for me, it became a stage of humiliation. I sat at the long table, watching the younger generation pass dishes, raise glasses, and exchange jokes. My daughter's husband was in his element, animated, confident, his voice rising above the others like a man performing for an audience that he believed belonged entirely to him. I could feel his eyes glancing toward me, not with kindness, but with the sharp edge of someone eager to prove superiority. The conversation turned, as it so often did, to business. Numbers, deals, markets, opportunities. The currency of pride among men who thought themselves builders of the future. And then, without hesitation, he struck. He lifted his glass, smirked faintly, and said loudly enough for the entire table to hear, "Well, of course, some people here will never understand how modern companies work. Times have changed. The world belongs to those who adapt." There was a pause, brief but heavy, and then laughter. Not cruel at first, but dismissive, the kind that carries the sting of superiority disguised as humor. Yet to me, each laugh was a strike, each smile a wound. I sat still, my hands resting on the tablecloth, my eyes lowered, as though the fabric itself might shield me from their amusement. My daughter's face reddened, her fork frozen in her hand, but again she said nothing. Her silence was a scream only I could hear. I felt the weight of decades pressing against me, decades of sacrifice, of nights spent working when others slept, of sweat poured into ventures that built the very world these young men now boasted about. But none of that mattered to them. To them, I was just an old man at the end of the table, a body occupying space, a ghost of something long forgotten. The food before me tasted of ash, the wine bitter in my mouth. Their words had taken from me not my appetite, but the dignity of being seen. He leaned back in his chair, proud of himself, proud of the laughter he had earned at my expense. I could see in his posture that he thought he had proven his point, that my silence was agreement, that his ridicule had carved truth into the room. And yet I remained calm. To fight would have been to lower myself to his stage, to join in the play he was performing for the approval of others. I had no need for their applause, for their understanding even. I had something deeper, something that time would eventually force him to recognize. But still, the sting of that evening lingered long after the plates were cleared. It was not the mockery alone that pained me, but the betrayal hidden in the laughter of those I had once carried, the eyes that refused to meet mine, the silence of the one who had been born from my sacrifices. Humiliation is a cruel guest. It does not leave when the night is over. It follows you home. It lies awake with you in the darkness. It whispers in your ear that your worth has been erased. Yet deep in my chest I held on to a single truth. The day would come when those same mouths that laughed would fall silent, and the same voice that mocked would tremble in recognition. That night was not the end of my dignity. It was only the beginning of its unveiling. My daughter could not meet my eyes that evening. The clinking of cutlery and the murmur of conversations seemed to surround her like a suffocating fog. But it was not the food or the guests that weighed on her chest. It was me. She saw me sitting there in silence, motionless, a man who absorbed insult and mockery without raising his voice, and it broke something inside her. She had always known her father as strong, as the unshakable rock in her life, the one who carried storms without complaint. But that night, she saw how the storm was not of the world outside, but of her own home, her own husband, her own silence. When her husband's laughter echoed and the guests joined in, she had felt a sharp stab of shame, not for me, but for herself. Shame that she had let it happen. Shame that she had not spoken up. Shame that she had watched the man who had given her everything be treated like nothing. She lowered her gaze, unable to bear the weight of my calm presence. For her, my silence was louder than any cry of pain could have been. It was not weakness, not defeat. It was a quiet dignity that filled the room and made her realize how small, how shallow, the laughter truly was. Memories surged in her mind, how I used to walk her to school, carrying her books when she was tired, waiting outside in the rain so she could finish her lessons. She remembered the sound of my voice, steady and patient as I helped her with work long after the lights should have been turned off. She remembered the little sacrifices she once took for granted. Clothes mended with care, meals stretched thinner so she would never feel the weight of scarcity. And now she sat beside a man who dismissed all of that as nothing, while she, his daughter, said nothing in return. That contradiction pressed on her chest like iron. As the plates were cleared and laughter faded into casual chatter, she dared to glance at me again. My face betrayed nothing. No anger, no humiliation, no bitterness. My eyes were calm, my posture steady. And it was this stillness, this refusal to retaliate, that shattered her most. For in that quiet, she saw a man greater than her husband could ever understand. She saw a man who did not need to defend his life, because his life already stood as its own defense. But even as she recognized it, the shame did not leave her. Instead, it deepened, for she realized she had failed me, not by marrying him, not by living her life, but by withholding the only shield I ever needed in that moment, her voice. Her silence had aligned her, even unwillingly, with those who mocked. That was her wound to carry, and she felt it burning inside her. She turned her eyes away once more, blinking back tears she dared not let fall at the table. To cry would have been to reveal the truth she was not brave enough to speak, and so she, too, wore a mask of composure, though inside her heart was breaking. She told herself the moment would pass, that one day her husband would see, that one day she would find the courage to defend me. But deep down she knew the damage had already been done. Silence leaves scars too, and hers was a scar she would carry long after that dinner ended. Day by day the distance grew, not measured in miles, but in words left unsaid and glances that carried quiet rejection. My daughter's husband became the architect of that divide, brick by brick, with subtle gestures that seemed harmless to others, but cut deeply when repeated. At first it was small things, shifting the conversation when I spoke, interrupting with a louder voice, pretending not to hear my stories as though they were background noise. Then it became bolder. He would glance at me across the table and change the subject the moment I opened my mouth, steering discussions toward topics I was not invited to join: investments, digital markets, deals cloaked in modern jargon. It was not ignorance he wanted to expose, but irrelevance. I began to notice the way he orchestrated family gatherings. My chair would be at the end of the table, my presence acknowledged politely but never embraced. He mastered the art of pretending kindness while quietly erasing my place. A comment here, a gesture there. Father-in-law is tired, let's not bother him with this, or that was before times changed, things are different now. Each phrase was like another stone in the wall he was building, a barrier between me and the family I once felt rooted in. My daughter rarely argued. She would smile faintly, sometimes glance at me with eyes full of apology, but her silence allowed him to continue. The grandchildren began to learn it too, though not by intention. Children notice more than adults admit. They saw how their grandfather's words were often ignored, how their father dismissed me with a smirk, how their mother avoided conflict by pretending not to hear. They absorbed the script silently, shaping their own perception of me through the example set before them. That realization hurt more than anything, because it meant the legacy I had built, the sacrifices I had made, were being rewritten in their young minds, not as strength but as weakness. Nights grew heavier. I would sit alone, remembering a time when my voice had carried weight, when my ideas mattered, when my daughter would look at me with eyes full of pride instead of quiet guilt. Now I felt like a shadow trailing behind my own family, tolerated but no longer seen. He had succeeded in crafting a narrative in which I was little more than a relic, a presence that reminded them of the past but offered nothing to the future. And perhaps worst of all, I had allowed it in silence. Yet silence was not surrender. It was patience. While he believed he was winning, reducing me to the margins, I carried within me a knowledge he could not fathom. His arrogance was built on foundations he did not even know existed. Foundations that bore my name, my labor, my sacrifices. I waited, enduring each slight, each dismissal, each calculated move to push me further away, because somewhere deep in my chest I knew a moment would come when the very wall he built to exclude me would crumble under the weight of truth. And when it did, the divide he had so carefully constructed would collapse into nothing, revealing what had been there all along, that I was never a shadow, but the root beneath the tree he so proudly called his own. The evening of the corporate dinner arrived like a crown he had been waiting to wear. My daughter's husband was dressed in his finest suit, his shoulders pulled back with pride, his voice carrying the tone of a man who believed he had been chosen for a stage greater than his own household. He relished the invitation, as though it were proof of his rising importance, as though the ink on that card elevated him above the rest of us. When he held it up for my daughter to see, his chest swelled with triumph. "You can come with me," he told her, his voice firm but indulgent, as though granting her permission. But when his eyes turned to me, the triumph sharpened into disdain. "I don't think there will be a place for you," he said, not cruelly, but with a cool finality that carried even more sting than open insult. In that single moment, he made it clear that he considered me unworthy of the room he was about to enter. My daughter stood frozen, torn between two men who defined her world. Her husband's words left her silent, her lips parting but producing nothing. She wanted to argue, to say that her father deserved to be there, to insist that no gathering of businessmen or leaders could diminish the value of the man who had raised her. But she said nothing. Her silence was her surrender, and she bowed her head as though accepting the verdict. She did not see the faint smile that passed across his face, a smile of victory, of a man who believed he had placed the final boundary between the past and the future. I did not argue. I did not protest. Instead, I simply nodded, my expression calm, my hands steady. But inside, the words pierced me. To be told by the man who had married my daughter that I had no place in the world he celebrated was a wound deeper than the laughter at the dinner table, deeper than the whispers in the hallway. It was an exile pronounced not in anger, but in certainty, as though my presence itself would tarnish his image in front of the people he admired. That night, as they prepared to leave, I dressed quietly, not in a suit of pride, not in clothes to impress, but in the dignity I had always carried. My daughter looked at me with unease when she saw me ready. She wanted to stop me, but she did not. Something in my stillness kept her from speaking. And so I walked with them into the night, my steps measured, my heart heavy but unwavering. The car ride was filled with his voice, boasting of who would be there, which executives had promised to attend, which opportunities awaited him. He spoke as if narrating the story of his own ascent, blind to the irony that he was a guest in a world built, in part, by hands like mine. Every sentence was a reminder that he believed me to be irrelevant, invisible, unfit for the world he worshipped. My daughter sat in silence, her hands clasped together in her lap, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. When the lights of the grand hall came into view, my son-in-law straightened his jacket and adjusted his tie, preparing himself for the stage of respect and recognition he thought awaited him. He glanced at me once more, almost as if to remind me, "This is not your place." But I walked beside him, silent, dignified, unshaken, for I knew something he did not, that the rooms he worshipped, the names he admired, the history he clung to as validation, all of it bore echoes of my own life. He thought he was entering a hall that belonged only to him, but he did not yet know that behind those walls my name had already been written long before his pride had found its voice. The hall glittered with chandeliers and polished silver, the air filled with the hum of voices eager to impress one another. Men in suits shook hands with rehearsed smiles, women in gowns moved gracefully between tables, and waiters glided past carrying trays of wine. It was the kind of evening designed to remind everyone present of their own importance. And into that glittering scene I walked beside my daughter and her husband, though I knew even before stepping inside that my presence was not welcome. At the entrance, names were checked, greetings exchanged. My son-in-law's chest swelled when his was recognized, his hand clasped firmly by a colleague who nodded in respect. He stood taller in that moment, proud of the place he believed he had carved for himself. Then their eyes turned to me, just briefly, a flicker of polite curiosity, and in that flicker I saw it. They did not know me. To them, I was an extra shadow trailing behind, a body too old to belong in a room pulsing with ambition. No one asked my name, no one offered me the same recognition. I was not introduced. I was merely tolerated. When we reached the table, the final act of exclusion unfolded quietly. My son-in-law guided my daughter toward a seat beside him, close to the center where the attention would fall, where conversations would flow. Then he looked at me, hesitated only a moment, and gestured toward a chair at the farthest edge. It was a place by the corner, half hidden, where the servers would pass first, and the voices of the powerful would barely reach. To anyone else, it may have seemed like nothing, but to me it was a sentence, a deliberate reminder that in his eyes I did not belong among the honored. I was a spectator, not a participant. I sat down without a word, folding my hands, my gaze steady. Around me, conversation swirled, laughter rose, glasses clinked. Faces turned to one another with eagerness, but no face turned to mine. I was invisible, and that invisibility burned hotter than mockery. To be mocked is to be acknowledged. To be erased is a cruelty deeper still. My daughter glanced at me from across the table. Her eyes pleaded with apology, but her lips never moved. She stayed at her husband's side, her silence binding her as firmly as his pride bound him. The food came and went, courses laid before me without taste. I heard the rise and fall of voices boasting about contracts, projects, ambitions, words heavy with pride, empty of humility. The young men at the table leaned forward to listen, eager to mirror their elders, while the elders performed as if every sentence were a rehearsal for history. I listened too, though no one spoke to me. Their world of self-congratulation had no seat for the man who once knew the burden of building without applause. And yet, even as I sat alone at the edge, something stirred quietly inside me. Not anger, not bitterness, but a stillness that comes from knowing more than others see. They thought my place at the far corner stripped me of dignity, but they did not know what truths waited beyond their laughter. They could not imagine that the foundation of the very room they so proudly filled had been touched, shaped, and secured by my own hands years before they ever stepped across its threshold. So I sat in silence as they celebrated in blindness, as my son-in-law basked in the illusion of triumph. He thought he had placed me in the shadows, a man of no consequence. What he did not realize was that shadows sometimes hold the deepest roots, and roots will always outlast the flowers that mock them. The room shifted when he entered. It was as though the air itself bowed to his presence, the laughter softening, the conversations halting, the clinking of glasses falling into silence. The boss, my son-in-law's superior, a man whose name carried weight in the city far beyond these walls, stepped through the grand doors with a calm authority that needed no announcement. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture for attention, yet all eyes turned to him. This was not a man who demanded respect. He embodied it. My son-in-law straightened instantly, his shoulders pulling back, his smile practiced, his hand brushing against his tie to ensure it was perfectly in place. I watched him from my distant corner as his entire being transformed into something rehearsed and eager. Gone was the smug casualness he wore with me, the dismissive tone, the easy arrogance. In its place stood a man desperate to be seen, desperate to be validated by the very authority walking into the room. His eyes glowed with ambition, his posture screamed of hunger. It was almost pitiable to watch, for I knew this hunger was rooted not in service or integrity, but in pride, a pride that sought applause rather than truth. The boss's steps were measured, his gaze sweeping the hall with familiarity. He greeted a few with nods, clasped hands with others, his presence a quiet storm of recognition. My son-in-law leaned slightly forward, waiting, as though the moment of his name being spoken aloud would crown him in front of all. His wife, my daughter, sat beside him, her face taut with nerves, knowing how much this meant to him, knowing how much he had invested in the illusion of control over this night. From my place in the corner, I felt invisible still. No one turned toward me, no one sought my presence. I might as well have been part of the furniture, an afterthought in the glow of power and ambition. Yet I sat calm, my expression unreadable, for within me there was a stillness they could not understand. My silence was not emptiness. It was a vessel waiting for the tide to rise. When the boss finally approached our table, the air grew heavier. My son-in-law rose slightly in his seat, his voice ready to pour out flattery, his hands poised for a handshake he had long imagined. His lips parted, eager to present himself, eager to remind the room, and perhaps even himself, that he belonged. He believed this was his moment, his triumph, the culmination of his climb. He did not know that the ground beneath his feet was about to shift. The boss's eyes moved across the table, pausing briefly on the faces gathered, his expression unreadable yet piercing. For a second, his gaze swept over me in the corner, and something flickered there, something my son-in-law could not see. Recognition. It was gone in an instant, hidden behind his calm, but it was enough to stir the silence inside me into a quiet anticipation. My son-in-law leaned forward, clearing his throat, ready to grasp his moment. The room seemed to lean with him, drawn into the expectancy he radiated. But beneath the glow of chandeliers and the hum of unspoken admiration, I felt the currents of fate shifting. The man my son-in-law worshipped, the man he longed to impress, was about to undo years of arrogance in a single breath. And all I had to do was wait. My son-in-law could hardly contain himself when the boss finally stood before the table, his face flushed with eagerness, his hands fidgeting with his glass as though even stillness would betray his excitement. The moment he had dreamed of had arrived, and he was determined to seize it, to shape it, to display himself as worthy of notice. He rushed to speak before anyone else could, his words tumbling out quickly, almost desperately, each syllable dipped in self-importance. "This is my wife," he said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear, as if her presence was another jewel in his crown. He did not look at her with tenderness, but with ownership, as though she were proof of his success. And then his hand moved toward me, his voice shifting into a tone so carefully measured it was almost cruel. "And this," he added, his lips curling into a faint smile that carried neither pride nor respect, "is my wife's father. He's retired now." The word hung in the air like dust. Retired. A single label, stripped of all the decades, the sacrifices, the foundations I had laid long before his career was even born. To him, it was not a season of honor, not a stage of life earned with sweat and resilience, but a dismissal. In his mouth, retired meant irrelevant, forgotten, no longer needed. He spoke as though I were a footnote, an afterthought in his narrative of ambition. His tone suggested I was a man with nothing left to offer, a relic sitting in the shadows only because family obligation demanded it. The boss's eyes shifted toward me, and in that moment something stirred in his expression, something my son-in-law was too blind to notice. He had expected the boss to nod politely and move on, to treat me as the inconsequential old man my son-in-law had painted me to be. But instead there was a pause, subtle but heavy. The kind of pause that stretches time, that makes the air grow thick. Around the table, no one noticed the weight of that silence. My daughter lowered her eyes, shame coloring her cheeks. She had heard her husband's tone. She had felt the dismissal wrapped in those words, and it cut her like a knife. To her, I was not simply her father. I was the man who had built her world, who had given her safety when she was small, who had carried burdens silently so that she might walk lightly. And now, to hear me introduced as nothing more than retired, her heart ached with guilt for not speaking, for not standing against the belittling that had become so routine. I sat in stillness, my face calm, though my chest burned with the sting of dismissal. I had long since learned that dignity does not require noise, that silence can carry more power than the sharpest retort. And so I let him finish his hurried introduction, his attempt to shrink me into a single word. For I knew what he did not, that in a moment the very man he sought to impress would reshape the room, and the weight of truth would shatter the illusion my son-in-law had built so carefully. It is a strange thing to be underestimated by those who think they know you. He saw me as frail, irrelevant, a passenger in life's carriage rather than the one who once laid the very road beneath its wheels. He thought he had defined me with a single word, retired. What he did not realize was that titles may fade, but legacies do not, and mine was about to speak louder than any introduction he could muster. The room held its breath in that fragile pause, the kind of silence that seems ordinary to the unknowing, but carries thunder for the one who waits. My son-in-law still smiled, still basked in the illusion of control, certain that his introduction had shaped the narrative. He could not see what I saw, the flicker in the boss's eyes, a spark of recognition that broke through the carefully measured calm of his face. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there, memory awakened, history stirring, truth refusing to stay buried. Then, without hesitation, the boss's expression transformed. A warmth spread across his features, not the shallow courtesy offered to strangers, but the rare joy of meeting someone whose name had been etched into his life. He pushed back his chair and stood, not out of obligation, not as a performance for those watching, but out of genuine respect. His hand extended toward me, steady and firm, reaching not for the shadow at the edge of the table, but for the man whose legacy still carried weight. And then came the words, my name, spoken aloud, not as a casual courtesy, not as a label, but as if it bore the weight of an entire era. He pronounced it with reverence, with recognition, with the kind of authority that silence cannot ignore. In that instant, my name was no longer invisible, no longer the afterthought my son-in-law had reduced it to. It was a name that commanded the room, that drew eyes from nearby tables, that shifted the entire current of the evening. The chandeliers seemed to burn brighter. The air itself seemed to thicken, as though the walls remembered with him. My son-in-law's smile faltered. He blinked, confusion flickering across his face as he realized something was wrong, something beyond his control. The boss's hand was not reaching for him. The admiration in the man's eyes was not for him. In the space of a heartbeat, the stage he had claimed for himself tilted, and he was no longer the center. The very ground beneath him began to tremble, though he tried to stand taller, tried to mask his unease. But the truth had already begun to rise, and truth does not ask permission to speak. Around the table, faces shifted from polite indifference to surprise. My daughter's eyes widened. Her breath caught as she realized that this moment was not like the others. The shame she had carried, the silence she had worn, began to crack under the light of recognition now flooding the room. She looked at me differently, as though seeing the outlines of a truth she had forgotten, a truth hidden too long in the shadows. I took the boss's hand, my grip steady, my face calm, though inside me stirred a tide of vindication, not gloating, not pride, but the quiet relief of being seen after so long unseen. His words, his gesture, his reverence, it was not flattery, it was truth spoken aloud at last. The power in the room shifted, the balance altered, and though no one yet fully understood, they all felt it. My son-in-law's stage had cracked, his performance undone, and he did not yet know that the collapse had only begun. The boss did not sit back down right away. His voice rose, not in volume, but in weight, carrying across the table and pulling the room into silence once more. He held my hand firmly, his gaze steady on me, as if anchoring the truth in front of everyone. Then he turned, his words flowing with the authority of a man who knew his audience would remember every syllable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone calm yet undeniable, "perhaps some of you don't know. This man is not simply retired. He is my partner, one of the founding architects of the company upon which all of this stands." The effect was immediate. Conversations died. Forks paused halfway to lips. Faces that had not so much as glanced in my direction now turned, their eyes wide with disbelief. The words cut through the illusion like lightning, splitting apart the fragile narrative my son-in-law had spun. In a single moment, the story of who I was shifted in the minds of everyone present. Not an irrelevant figure in the corner, not a pensioner surviving on faded days, but a man whose work and vision had laid the very foundations of the empire they gathered to celebrate. My son-in-law's smile collapsed, his pride draining from his face. He sat frozen, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the boss and me as though he had misheard, as though the reality unfolding before him could not possibly be true. But it was. His mockery, his condescension, his dismissal, all of it crumbled in that instant, exposed under the weight of truth spoken by the one man he most wanted to impress. Around the table, whispers began to stir. Some leaned closer, murmuring my name as if testing it on their tongues, recalling half-forgotten stories, fragments of history that suddenly found their center. Others simply stared, the image of me they had carried collapsing against the reality now revealed, and my daughter, her eyes filled with tears she could no longer hide. In her silence was both shame and relief, shame for the moments she had allowed me to be diminished, relief that the world was finally seeing what she had always known deep down. I sat without moving, my face calm, my breath steady, though inside me rose a tide that years of silence had held back. It was not triumph I felt, not even vindication. It was something quieter, something heavier. It was the weight of being recognized not for pride's sake, but for truth's sake. For years I had endured whispers, laughter, dismissal, exile from conversations. For years I had chosen silence, not because I was weak, but because I knew truth does not need a defender. It only needs its time. And now that time had come. The boss placed his other hand on my shoulder, his voice filled with respect. Without him, none of us would be here. The company you praise, the success you celebrate, the very seats you occupy, it began with his hands, his vision, his sacrifices. His words were not grandiose flattery. They were history spoken aloud, undeniable and unerasable. And as they echoed across the hall, the weight of mockery that had once pressed upon me dissolved into nothing. The hall had shifted. The balance of power no longer belonged to the young man desperate for attention. It belonged to truth, and truth had spoken my name. The room seemed to tremble as the boss's words spread across it like a tide no one could resist. Every head turned, every conversation died, every sound shrank beneath the weight of what had been revealed. He did not stop after naming me as a founder. His voice grew steadier, stronger, carried not by the need to impress, but by the burden of truth that demanded to be spoken. He gestured with an open hand, his eyes scanning the room before returning to me. If not for him, he said, his tone both reverent and fierce, these walls would not exist. This success you celebrate tonight, this company you admire, it would not have been born. He is the foundation on which we all stand. A hush fell so complete that even the clinking of glasses seemed afraid to intrude. My name, once dismissed, once reduced to nothing by careless lips, now carried the weight of permanence. People shifted in their chairs, their expressions changing from indifference to awe, from polite ignorance to sudden reverence. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed that they had laughed earlier, ashamed they had not recognized what had been in their midst all along. My daughter sat with her hands trembling on her lap, her eyes glistening. She could not hide it any more. The pride, the sorrow, the release of a truth finally spoken aloud. For years she had carried the sting of her husband's words, his quiet campaign to diminish me, his smug dismissal of all that I had lived and done. And now, before her very eyes, the man her husband worshipped, the man whose opinion meant everything in his world, had unveiled the truth that no insult could erase. She looked at me not with pity, not with regret, but with the dawning realization that dignity does not demand defense, it demands patience. And I had waited long enough. My son-in-law, by contrast, looked hollow, as though the ground beneath him had given way. The smirk that had so often decorated his lips was gone. In its place lingered a pale stiffness, the fragile mask of a man whose arrogance had been stripped bare. He had thought me a shadow, a relic, a burden at the edge of the table. Now, in the space of a few words, he was the one diminished, dwarfed by a truth too heavy for his pride to carry. The boss's hand pressed gently against my shoulder, his voice softening yet carrying more power than any speech could. He gave more than years. He gave himself, his time, his strength, his sacrifices. And everything we are, everything we build, will always stand on his name. His words were not decoration. They were testimony. And as they echoed through the hall, I felt the quiet weight of years of dismissal finally lift, replaced not by pride, but by peace. The hall no longer belonged to those who mocked, nor to those who sought to shine with borrowed light. In that moment the hall belonged to truth, and the truth was that I had never been invisible. I was the stone beneath their feet, the unseen hand that made their celebration possible, and finally they were forced to see it. The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter that had filled the hall before. It pressed down on every table, every chair, every guest, until the only sound left was the quiet echo of the boss's words still hanging in the air. My son-in-law sat rigid, his face drained of color, the confident spark in his eyes extinguished. He had built his pride like a tower of glass, tall and gleaming, and in one breath it had shattered into dust. His lips trembled slightly, as though he wished to speak, to recover, to explain away the truth that had just crushed him, but no words came. For what excuse could erase the weight of a legacy revealed in front of the very people he longed to impress? Those who had moments before seen me as nothing more than a frail old man now struggled to meet my gaze. Their eyes shifted nervously, shame written in the tightening of jaws and the sudden stillness of hands. They had joined in the laughter, had nodded along to his dismissals, had carried the same arrogance that blinded him. And now, confronted with the truth, they could not look at me without feeling the sting of their complicity. Whispers stirred around the room, not the careless whispers of mockery, but the hushed tones of people realizing they had misjudged a man who deserved far more than silence. My daughter's eyes overflowed, though she tried to hold herself together. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks, tears of both pride and guilt. Pride for the father she now saw standing taller than ever, not because he demanded recognition, but because truth itself had lifted him above every insult. And guilt because she had been silent when her husband had cut me down, because she had let those words echo unanswered in the spaces between us. Yet in that moment, her shame was not the final note. Her awe was. She saw me not just as her father, but as something more. The foundation of a world her husband had pretended to own. The shame in my son-in-law's eyes was different. It was not the shame of remorse, but of exposure. He had been stripped of the armor he wore so carefully, the image of control, the illusion of superiority. What remained was a hollow man, caught in the act of belittling someone whose name carried far more weight than his own. He could not bring himself to look at me, though I sat quietly, offering no retaliation, no glance of triumph. My silence was a mirror, forcing him to see himself as he truly was. And in that silence, the hall shifted. I was no longer the invisible figure in the corner. I was no longer the shadow pushed to the edges of the table. The guests who had looked through me now looked toward me, their faces carrying the awe that comes when truth sweeps the floor clean of lies. My presence, once ignored, now filled the room with a weight that could not be denied. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand to boast. I simply remained, steady, calm, dignified, and that was enough. The shame in their eyes was not my victory. It was their burden to carry, the mark left by their own blindness. But in that moment, I knew that I no longer carried mine. I did not rise to speak, nor did I let triumph break the stillness that had become my shield. Words were unnecessary, for everything that needed to be said had already been spoken by another, in a voice of truth that carried further than pride ever could. I sat there in the glow of chandeliers, my hands folded, my gaze steady, while the eyes of the room clung to me with a reverence that had not been there before. I felt no need to scold, no desire to humiliate those who had mocked me. Their own shame was punishment enough, their own silence heavier than any rebuke I could give. My son-in-law's face was pale, his shoulders stiff, his chest rising and falling as though he were trapped in a room with no air. He could not lift his eyes to mine, for he knew that if he did, he would see not anger, but something worse, dignity. Dignity that needed no audience, no applause, no vengeance. Dignity that spoke more loudly in silence than his arrogance ever had in words. He had expected, perhaps even braced, for a lecture or a scolding, something he could argue against or defend himself from. But I gave him nothing. My calmness became a mirror, forcing him to see himself with brutal clarity. The guests, too, watched in quiet awe. They had witnessed the fall of a man's pride and the rise of another's truth, but what struck them most was not the revelation of my past. It was the way I carried it. They expected perhaps a speech, a claim, a declaration of vindication. Instead, I gave them silence. Silence that carried the weight of years. Silence that spoke of endurance, of sacrifices made without needing to be recorded, of a life that had already proven itself beyond argument. My daughter wept quietly, not from sorrow now, but from release. She saw that I needed no defense, no explanation, no shield. I had already won long before this evening, not through confrontation, but through the life I had lived. Her tears fell not for my pain, but for her own, for all the nights she had let his words stand unanswered, for the years she had believed silence meant weakness, when in truth it was the greatest strength of all. She reached for my hand beneath the table, her fingers trembling, and when I gently squeezed back, it was not to comfort her, it was to tell her she was forgiven. I gave only one gesture that night. I nodded, a slow and steady bow of the head, accepting the respect that had come too late but still come. That simple nod held more power than any speech, for it was not the nod of a man desperate for recognition, but of a man who already knew who he was. They had finally caught up with the truth I had carried quietly all along, and in that moment, no one could take it from me. The hall was silent, reverent. I did not need fury, for fury fades. I did not need revenge, for revenge poisons the victor as much as the defeated. I needed only dignity, and dignity stood taller than any throne built on pride. That night, something changed forever. My name, once spoken with indifference or even dismissal, now carried a weight that silenced the hall. It no longer drifted carelessly on lips. It was pronounced with respect, with reverence, with the quiet awe that comes when truth finally tears away pretense. I felt it in the way people turned toward me, not out of curiosity but out of recognition, as though seeing for the first time the figure they had overlooked in their blindness. For my daughter, I was no longer the quiet shadow at the table. I was once again the father she had always known, the anchor who had carried her through storms, the steady hand she had leaned on as a child. Her eyes, filled with tears, no longer looked at me with shame. They looked with pride, with love, with the relief of seeing the world finally honor what she had always held in her heart. For my son-in-law, the lesson was carved deep, sharper than any reprimand. He sat broken in his silence, unable to lift his gaze, knowing that the man he had tried to belittle stood infinitely taller than his arrogance ever had. His pride had been exposed for the hollow shell it was, and in its ruins stood the truth he could never again deny, that the foundation of the very company he served, the very stage on which he sought to shine, had been laid by the man he had mocked. In his shame, he learned too late that respect is not given to those who demand it, but to those who earn it quietly, over years, through sacrifice and endurance. The guests, too, carried the weight of the revelation. They would leave that hall changed, whispering my name not with dismissal but with the gravity of history. They would remember not the wine, or the speeches, or the laughter, but the moment an old man in the corner became the figure who redefined the room. My silence had spoken louder than fury, and my dignity had left an imprint no one could erase. As I rose to leave, I did not look back for applause. I did not crave the acknowledgement of those who had mocked me. I walked slowly, calmly, each step echoing with a life that needed no defense. Behind me, the whispers grew, not in ridicule, but in awe, and I knew then that my legacy was no longer a quiet truth carried only within me. It had become undeniable, unerasable, carved into the memory of everyone who had witnessed that night. For my daughter, I was once again her shelter. For my son-in-law, I was the lesson he could never outrun. For the world around that table, I was the example of what it meant to endure humiliation with grace, to meet arrogance with patience, to let truth reveal itself in its own time. My name would outlive the laughter, outlast the whispers, and remain standing when pride had turned to dust. That was the legacy of my life. That was the legacy of my name.